So let me just share my screen. 1 minute. So welcome everybody. My name is Daniela Ozacky Stern, and I am proud to be part of the Holocaust Studies Program of the Western Galilee College in Akko, Israel. We are delighted to welcome you yet again to another fascinating virtual event in our Zoom series, which started about 2 years ago when the coronavirus had become part of our life. I'm so happy to see here many familiar faces of friends and colleagues, and welcome the newcomers. Our event tonight commemorates 80 years to June 1942, a crucial month in World War II, dramatic days of war, defeat, and mass murder, as the title indicates. Significant events took place during those spring months and especially in June, both in the military theater of war and in the genocidal scene. And I will mention just a few to refresh our memory regarding this tragic month. Following Operation Anthropoid, the assassination of Reinhardt near Prague on May 27, 1942, and his death from his wounds on June 4th, a deadly massacre occurred in the Czech villages of Lidice and Ležáky. Thousands of Jews were expelled from the Krakow ghetto to the Belzec death camp, and the ghetto area had been decreased. A violent action in Tarnów took place with 4,000 Jews killed on the spot and about 8,000 deported to Belzec. And immediately after, the Tarnów ghetto was established. In June 1942, thousands of Jews were murdered in violent actions in ghettos in Belarus. Our aim today is to focus on this particular month by listening to two distinguished scholars, Taylor Donning and Jan Grabowski, who will share with us their research and insights. I want to thank both of you for accepting our invitation so willingly. We are all looking forward to a productive and stimulating discussion. And as always, I want to thank my dear colleagues and the organizers of this event, Dr. Boaz Cohen, head of the Holocaust Studies Program, Dr. Yaron Pasher, and Jan Burzlaff. Thank you so much. And as always, some technical notes. We are recording this session and we will upload it to our website. And please keep your microphones on mute. And now it is my pleasure to give the floor to Dr. Boaz Cohen. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniela. After Daniela did it so nicely, I will find it hard to compete. I will just say that the issue of June 1942 is for us a central issue in our attempts to tell the story of the Holocaust and World War II together. Because usually Holocaust scholars know a lot about 1942, June 1942, and the whole spring, summer of 1942. And military historians have a lot to say, and Taylor Downing's book is full of military defeat in the whole of 1940, but also in June. I'm using June 1942 as a showcase to explain to the students how the whole story comes together. I see I have a spelling mistake. I'll say that David Zilberklang of Yad Vashem has said that the timetable of the Holocaust and the timetable of World War II don't fit, in the sense that when Operation Reinhardt takes place, the Allies are actually losing the war, as the Taylor will show, I'm sure. And they are far away from Poland. They are losing not in one theater of war, but in all, apart from the Midway battle, and it's still not a victory in the Pacific yet, they are losing all over. And they are not there to think or do anything about the Jews. And I think this understanding gives us a clear picture of the whole story, of where the genocide fits in and where the war fits in the narratives, in the two narratives. So the timetables don't fit, but actually they do fit. The Germans are winning the war against the Jews, and they're winning the war against the Allies in June. It changes later, but now we are talking about defeats. And I think this is a very important notion. And this is the way I try to explain to my students. We work on each one of these subjects to understand what the World War II was all about, how it went about, and how this connects or this is not connected to the fate of the Jews. And I will finish here. This was just a showcase because it was obvious for us that we must do something about June 1942, and we are so thankful for you both for coming. I'll stop share. Yes, without further ado, Yaron, introduce.
Okay. Thank you, Boaz. Thank you, Daniela, for this wonderful introduction. I'll just add two figures to the event. In 1942, the German U-boats sink more than 5.8 million tons of Allied merchant ships in the Atlantic. And in June 1942 alone, 146 Allied battleships are sunk by German U-boats. So this only gives us an indication where we're standing at the perspective the war is at this particular time. And now I will have the privilege and honor of introducing our first speaker tonight. And we have a very interesting program for you. Taylor Downing is a historian, writer, television producer, and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Taylor Downing read history at Christ College, Cambridge, and after teaching at Leeds University, he went into the field of television to make historical documentaries. He founded an independent production company in the UK, Flashback Television, and produced about 300 historical documentaries for broadcasters around the world, many of which won awards in the UK and the US. For the last 15 years, he has been writing history and has produced several best-selling books, including Cold War Churchill's War Lab on Churchill and the Maverick Scientists he supported, Spies in the Sky on Photo Intelligence in World War II, The Crisis of Shell Shock in the Zone was one of the Times must-read books of 2016. In 1983, The World at the Brink on little-known Cold War scare story was shortlisted for the Pushkin Prize, and his most recent book, 1942, Britain at the Brink, was published in January 2022. So it is my honor to introduce Taylor Downing. Please, Taylor, the floor is yours, the Zoom.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a very generous and kind welcome. Thank you. And as you said, my contribution this evening is very much focusing on the British angle and the perspective in Britain, and particularly with the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, in the course of 1942, the run up to June, not just the month of June, but to try to give you some of the colour of feelings in Britain at what I call in the book Churchill's blackest hour. And just to go back just very briefly, when Japan invaded Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, Churchill immediately felt that the war was won. With America and the Soviet Union as allies, the Prime Minister knew that victory one day was certain. And on the evening of which he actually heard the news of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Churchill was at Chequers, which is a country house outside London, which was then and even today is used by the Prime Minister. It was a weekend, it was a Sunday evening, and he was at Chequers. And when he heard the news of Pearl Harbor, he had a very brief conversation with Roosevelt in Washington on the telephone, who said, yes, we're all in the same boat now. The United States, of course, had been neutral up to that point. And as Churchill's aides and secretaries rushed about frantically sending messages to the Foreign Office, to the Speaker of the House of Commons, to other heads of state and members of the government, a much relieved Churchill simply left them to it and retired to bed. He later said that on that night, he slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. At that point, of course, he had no idea of the disasters that were about to follow over the next 9 months or so. Only 3 days later, after the news of Pearl Harbor, he received the devastating news of the sinking of the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse by Japanese bombers flying out of what had been French Indochina. It was a massive loss of life. I think more than 800 sailors were drowned. He took it particularly badly, Churchill, because it was he who had actually ordered these ships to press ahead without an air escort in order to provide a sort of form of deterrence against the Japanese, which obviously failed miserably. In all the war, I never received a more direct shock, he wrote later. British, Indian and Malayan forces and Australian forces in Malaya were soon completely outmaneuvered by Japanese troops advancing rapidly down the peninsula. The Japanese were led by a very ferocious, determined, quick-thinking commander, General Yamashita, and the imperial forces were poorly equipped, were untrained for jungle warfare. They would build a defensive barrier across a main road. The advancing Japanese would simply move out into the jungle, surround the barrier. The troops would be outflanked. The British or imperial troops would be outflanked and rushed into a hasty and disorganized retreat. Thousands surrendered. One by one, all the key defensive strongholds across the Malayan Peninsula fell to the Japanese. Communications collapsed. Supplies of petrol and huge depots of food, equipment, and vehicles were abandoned. Retreating units leapfrogged over each other in hasty withdrawals. Entire battalions were wiped out, either killed, wounded, or left behind to surrender. With the Japanese advancing so rapidly down through the Malayan Peninsula, Churchill wrote to the Australian Prime Minister John Curtin at the time, and he told him that Malaya might well fall. He wrote, and I quote, "I don't see how anyone could expect Malaya to be defended once the Japanese obtain command of the sea, and while we're fighting for our lives against Germany and Italy." In an openly racist remark, Churchill said that the Japanese had advanced so rapidly because up to that point they'd faced only a tiny number of white troops, the rest being Indian soldiers. In reality, the Indian units had all been milked, was the phrase at the time. All the most skilled NCOs and officers had been withdrawn from the Indian units to fight in the Middle East with the British. But Churchill still expressed his confidence that Singapore, this great fortress that had been built up over the last 15 or so years from the mid-20s onwards, a giant naval fortress, military fortress in the Far East, that Singapore could be defended and that a counterstroke will be possible later in February. When the defenders had finally withdrawn to the last line just north of Johor, Australian troops were thrown into the action. They fared absolutely no better, couldn't prevent the seemingly unstoppable Japanese advance. It was a rout of absolutely disastrous proportions. And the Japanese, by mid-February, had advanced and were looking on, were directly outside the island of Singapore. But before that could play out, there was a further humiliation when 3 German warships, the battle cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, cheekily raced from Brest. They had been in the French port of Brest. They raced directly up the English Channel to return to their Baltic base. In broad daylight, they sailed right through the Straits of Dover. The straits between Dover and Calais are no more than 35 kilometers wide. And due to a series of appalling blunders, failures in communication, naval destroyers, RAF bombers, the shore batteries at Dover, failed to score a single hit on these 3 German ships. The press, the British press, were up in arms. It was one thing to lose ships on the other side of the world, but if the Royal Navy couldn't even protect the famous White Cliffs of Dover, then what on earth could they do? The Manchester Guardian asked why the Japanese were able to sink the Prince of Wales and repulse off Malaya, but the RAF couldn't even score a single hit on the German warships as they passed so close to Dover. The Daily Mail, a relatively right-wing paper in Britain, very supportive of Churchill, for the first time produced a leader that was both anti-government and anti-Churchill. And the Daily Mirror again blamed Churchill by asking, and I quote, "Is it any longer true to say that we trust the Prime Minister, though we don't trust the government?" It went on, "If Mr. Churchill continues to impose his will on Parliament and on strategy, his great qualities will no longer be an asset to the nation, but a peril." Churchill was thrown into despair by the fiasco. Sir Alexander Cadogan of the Foreign Office wrote in his diary, "The blackest day of the war yet. We're nothing but failure and inefficiency everywhere." Henry Channon, known as Chips Channon, an MP who wasn't a supporter of Churchill at all, but he wrote in his diary of the attack by the Daily Mail, "This is the first time that anything like this has ever appeared." But he said that the public too were outraged by the humiliation. "Everyone is in a rage," he wrote, against the Prime Minister. Rage, frustration. This is not the post-Dunkirk feeling, but anger. The capital seethes with indignation. Mass Observation was a British opinion gathering organisation that some of you might know of. Observers were sent out by the central organisation to write down verbatim what people were saying on a particular topic. They listened to people talking in shops, in canteens, in cinema queues, and wrote down exactly what was being said. In addition, volunteers across the country kept a diary in which again they wrote down verbatim, as far as they could, conversations they'd had with people. Mass Observation used all this data to provide regular assessments of morale to the Home Intelligence Unit of the Ministry of Information. Today, its records offer an absolutely fascinating, unique insight into the concerns and attitudes of British people throughout the war, but particularly throughout this tumultuous year of 1942. And I used the Mass Observation archives, which are in Sussex, linked with the University of Sussex. I used the archives very extensively in my book. On the day that the news broke about these German ships passing through the Straits of Dover, an observer in a corner shop in Yorkshire, in the north of England, wrote down what some of her customers were saying. One of them said, "What have they been doing to let them ships escape? They've made fools of us, haven't they?" The fact that Britannia couldn't rule the distant oceans, but couldn't even command the channel just outside the White Cliffs of Dover, clearly grated with a lot of people. A male customer said, "It's time we bucked up, what with one thing and another. It's only the Russians are doing out." That's the only the Russians are doing anything. They wouldn't have let them ships pass, you bet. Another lady in this shop complained, "This is that it happened under our noses." She was absolutely outraged. Now, none of this is a scientific analysis of opinion, but it's an insight into one particular shop that was probably very common. The ideas and the comments I've just read out were probably expressed in many shops across Britain. 2 days later, after this news of the ships going through the strait, the German ships passing right through the Straits of Dover in broad daylight, 2 days after that, there was worse news when the garrison of about 90,000 Imperial troops surrendered to a Japanese force of just 23,000. Photographs of the British Commander-in-Chief, Lieutenant General Percival, walking out with a white flag to surrender went around the world, and nothing symbolized British imperial collapse more vividly than that image. Britain's power and prestige in the Far East never recovered. India felt itself directly threatened. Australia realigned itself more with the United States. And Churchill saw the capitulation of the fortress at the heart of Britain's defence of the whole of the Far East as another terrible humiliation. In a speech to the Conservative Party Central Council a few weeks later, he said, quote, "Singapore has been the scene of the greatest disaster to British arms which our history records." He certainly didn't hold back. The humiliating collapse in Singapore added to popular criticism of the Prime Minister and his government. The press was convinced that Churchill was carrying too much weight on his shoulders, controlling both wartime military strategy and the political direction of the nation. Again, Mass Observation recorded a range of comments of those supporting this view. One 50-year-old man said, "I reckon Churchill's got too much on his hands to conduct this war properly." A younger man was recorded as saying, "Make Anthony Eden." Anthony Eden was Churchill's deputy in the Conservative Party and the Foreign Secretary at the time. He said, "Make Anthony Eden Minister of Defence and give him a free hand." A 25-year-old woman commented, "I think Churchill's taking too much on himself." And another Mass Observer recorded that up to now, the government has been criticised often, but always with the reservation that Churchill's all right. But now Churchill is condemned with the rest. One friend of the Observer said, "It's time we had a new government. Churchill's taking too much on himself these days." Another was reported as saying, "He roared all right in his time, but he's outlived it." When Churchill's daughter Mary visited Downing Street for a private lunch alone with her parents later that month, she found her father in a state of depression. "Papa is at a very low ebb," she wrote in her diary. "He's not too well physically, and he's worn down by the continuous crushing pressure of events. He's sad and appalled by events." But even more humiliations followed in the spring and early summer of 1942. British and Imperial troops were once again routed, this time in Burma. Another Imperial capital, Rangoon, fell to the Japanese in March. The vital route to China was cut, leaving China isolated from overland supplies from the outside world. British, Indian, and Gurkha troops in May of 1942 withdrew across the mountains to the frontier of India. It had been another disastrous campaign, and having covered 900 miles, became known as the longest retreat in British history. And the Japanese were now at the gates of India. At that point, a large Japanese carrier force of 5 aircraft carriers, supported by battleships, cruisers, and 11 destroyers, moved into the Indian Ocean. Bombing raids began on towns on the east coast of India, prompting an invasion square. In the pandemonium, refugees flooded out of Madras and Calcutta and other coastal towns into the interior. Vast numbers of people were on the move. It looked as though the Japanese were preparing to invade India. Now, of course, the defense of India was a political as well as a military issue. Churchill had served in India as a young man, as a young officer in the army in the 1890s. He saw British rule there as the natural and just order of affairs. He'd resisted throughout his career any suggestion that the breakup of the British Raj was possible. And now, with Japan battering the gates, Indian nationalists might take advantage of imperial weakness to attempt to overthrow British rule once and for all. And again, the need for reform in India leapt up the political agenda to avoid a collapse of the Raj. Most people, other than the very hard right supporting Churchill, most people in Britain who thought about the issue of India in the post-war world believed that Britain's colonial relationship with the continent couldn't remain the same as before the war. Molly Panter Downs was a journalist writing in London, but for an American magazine. And she wrote at the time, and I quote, "Few intelligent Britons think that post-war Asia will settle down into the cosy old pattern of empire, with mad dogs and Englishmen in sole enjoyment of the midday sun." But that certainly wasn't Prime Minister Churchill's view, and the defence of India rapidly rose to the top of a military agenda. In April of 1942, reviewing the general situation, General Alan Brooke, who was the chief of the Imperial Staff, so he's the most senior army officer, the commanding officer of the entire British Army, effectively, but also the chair of the Chiefs of Staff, General Alan Brooke confided to his diary, and I quote, "I don't like the look of things. I suppose this empire has never been in such a precarious position throughout its history. I wish I could see more daylight as to how we're to keep going through 1942. Then things started to go wrong. If all this wasn't enough, things started to go wrong in the Middle East, where the much reinforced 8th Army under Lieutenant General Neil Ritchie was fighting the Germans and the Italians, led by the ever-resourceful General Erwin Rommel. The 8th Army was resoundingly defeated by Rommel at the Battle of Gazala in early June 1942. His main force started to retreat rapidly across the border into Egypt towards Cairo and Alexandria. He left a small garrison at Tobruk to hold up and to delay Rommel's advance. But after a major air raid on the morning of the Saturday the 20th of June, German panzers penetrated the outer defences of the Libyan port. And on the following day, 80 years ago, yesterday, in fact, on the 21st of June, 1942, the South African commander raised the white flag of surrender. Around 33,000 Allied troops surrendered to an Axis force of about half that number. In the previous year, Fortress Tobruk had survived about 8 months under siege. But in June 1942, it fell to Rommel in a weekend. Churchill was at a meeting in the White House with President Roosevelt when news came through of the fall of Tobruk. He was overcome, and he later wrote, I quote, "This was one of the heaviest blows I can recall during the war. Not only were its military effects grievous, but it had affected the reputation of the British armies. I did not attempt to hide from the President the shock I had received. It was a bitter moment. Defeat is one thing. Disgrace is another." In some ways, Churchill only really had himself to blame for all of this. When he became Prime Minister in May 1940, he had taken on the role of Minister of Defence as well as that of Prime Minister. There was no precedent in British history for this. So he was responsible not only for the strategic decisions of the military operations in the war, but also for the political leadership of the country. And blame for strategic failures and military disasters would always ultimately, in that case, come back to him. During the first 6 months of 1942, there had been 2 hostile motions in the House of Commons. In Westminster, in January, he easily defeated a motion of no confidence, but in late June 1942, the month we're talking about, he faced a vote of censure. This was a more serious attack upon his leadership, which largely collapsed because the opposition failed to provide a credible alternative military leader for the war effort. However, in the spring of 1942, a serious political rival did emerge in a man called Sir Stafford Cripps. He's a figure who's actually quite often forgotten in Britain today, but he played a very major role in the war and the post-war Labour government. And at this point, Cripps comes forward as a serious rival, a serious alternative prime minister. The contrast with Churchill couldn't have been greater. Churchill was an old school conservative and an imperialist. He had a rounded figure that came from his love of champagne, brandy, good food, cigars. By contrast, Cripps was a committed left-winger who dallied with Marxism. He was tall and lean, a teetotaler and a vegetarian. But his persona at this point seemed to chime with the increasingly austere climate of the war. And in 1942, in the spring of 1942, he captured the mood of the nation. He had a powerful group of what today would be called special advisors around him, who were adept at getting their boss into the newspapers. He was presented as being forward-looking, progressive, clear-minded, super efficient. And having been ambassador in Moscow until January 1942, he became very associated in the public eye with the heroic Soviet defense of their country, rather than associated with the run of British military disasters. He was certainly the man of the moment. And one report from the Ministry of Information noted that, quote, Cripps, day after day, the name hits the headlines in British newspapers. Day after day, when men talk about war or politics, they talk about Cripps. And I think it was his plain, austere approach that really captured the mood of so many people in Britain. A mass observation, yet again, identifies a growing public support for him and reported that he was the first alternative leader figure to Churchill since the fall of Neville Chamberlain. The mood in Britain in June 1942 was thoroughly depressed. A mass observation diarist in a small village in Hampshire noted down some of the comments she overheard. One friend was, quote, in a state of great bitterness over events in the Far East. And she said she thought we would be under German rule before too long. She also noted, we had a chat with some friends passing by who pleaded guilty to having totally lost faith in Churchill and this government, and hoped and expected a tremendous upheaval in the country, culminating with Sir Stafford Cripps becoming number one, and a real total war effort expected from everybody. So the summer and early autumn of 1942 was not only a precarious time for Britain's war effort, the American war effort, but a very precarious time for Churchill personally. And he frequently humiliated his army chiefs by asking them very openly in cabinet, haven't you got a single general in your army who can win battles? But with Churchill being regularly rounded on by the press, mass observation continued to pick up these reports of public support falling off a cliff. People said he'd taken on too much responsibility, that he was past it, that he was no longer the man to win the war. Of course, as you referred to, Bert, just a little while ago, things did change in the latter part, the final months of 1942. A newly restored 8th Army under General Bernard Montgomery prepared once again to take on the Afrika Korps and the Italians under Field Marshal Rommel. But just before then, on the evening of 1st of October, Churchill told Eden that if the upcoming operations in the Middle East failed, quote, then I'm done for and must go and hand over to one of you. A few days later, a close friend, Lord Beaverbrook, told Eden that Churchill was not the man he was. And Churchill later wrote that for him, September and October 1942 were the two most anxious months of the war. It was in this context that Britain almost turned inwards, agonizing over its own military failures. And in a democracy, of course, military failures usually usher in a political crisis. Autocrats, tyrants can survive military disasters. They can control the media and don't reveal the extent of their failure. They can punish anyone who speaks out against them. And of course, this is exactly what Putin is doing in Russia today. He's taken complete control of the media. He can punish anybody with up to 15 years imprisonment who takes a different line to his. But Britain was a democracy in 1942. As I've explained, there was outright and powerful opposition to the Prime Minister within the House of Commons. The press frequently and openly attacked him, and the BBC, although it operated under rules of government censorship, the BBC was still broadcasting, both to Britain and to Europe, news of military defeats and humiliating setbacks. Britain's limited war planning in the late 1930s had imagined a situation in which the UK might be at war either against Germany and Italy in Europe or against a nationalist, militarist regime from Japan in the Far East, one or the other, but not both at the same time. And in 1942, when Britain's limited military resources found itself simultaneously fighting in Japan, fighting against Japan in Malaya, Burma, the Bay of Bengal, and Germany and Italy and North Africa, it simply couldn't cope. But as everyone knows, Montgomery and his 8th Army delivered a great victory at El Alamein in October, the end of October, early November 1942, and when followed 5 days later by the Anglo-American landings in French Northwest Africa, Operation Torch, the pendulum finally began to swing. Churchill ordered the church bells to be rung across the country. In 1940, this was a signal that a German invasion was taking place. Now, in 1942, it celebrated a great victory. By mid-December, Churchill's political fortunes had been restored. He'd survived the gravest crisis of his premiership. 1940 is the year that's usually thought to be Churchill's most difficult year as Prime Minister, the fall of France, the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, and so on. But in reality, I argue that proved to be his finest hour. It's often imagined that from 1940 onwards, it was sort of relatively plain sailing along the long, slow route to final victory in 1945. But that really wasn't the case. Churchill's blackest hour came in 1942, when he dictated his memoir history about events of this year. That was in 1950, only a few years later. He wrote that 1942 consisted of galling links in a chain of misfortune and frustration to which no parallel could be found in our history. He reflected that had he been dismissed during that year of military disasters, he would have vanished from the scene with a load of calamity on my shoulders. In 1942, this run of military disasters that I've been talking about took Britain and its war leader to the brink. Then at last, military events turned in his favour. Politically secure again, he would fight on to final victory. But the summer of 1942 had without doubt been his darkest hour. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Taylor, for a thought-provoking paper, which I think transforms our collective image of Winston Churchill's leadership in this particular period of the war. I might just mention Ivan Maisky's memoirs that were recently published by Gabriel Gorodetsky, and the Stafford Cripps is all over those papers. So with his mission to Moscow. So thank you very much for this very interesting lecture.
Maisky, just to interject there, Yaron, just very, very briefly. Ivan Maisky was, of course, in the House of Commons, in the chamber, at the censure vote in June 1942 that we were talking about. He was absolutely taken aghast at this very public outpouring of hostility towards a war leader that he knew would never, ever be conceivably popular in Moscow. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So Thank you. We'll continue the discussion later. Our next speaker today is Professor Jan Grabowski. And Dr. Grabowski is a full professor of history of the Holocaust at the University of Ottawa and the co-founder of the Polish Center for Holocaust Research at the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology of the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw. He's a graduate of the University of Warsaw and the Université de Montréal. His research includes the issues surrounding the extermination of the Polish Jews, as well as the history of the Jewish-Polish relations during the 1939-1945 period. Professor Grabowski is a prolific author who has produced over 60 articles and more than 14 monographs in various languages. Grabowski is best known for his book, Hunt for the Jews, Betrayal and Murder in German-Occupied Poland, published with Indiana University Press in 2013, which has been awarded the Yad Vashem International Book Prize for 2014. Other monographs include Criminalizing the Jews in Occupied Warsaw 1939 to 1942 with Baba Engelking, and Rescue for Money, Paid Helpers in Poland 1939 till 1945, which was published in the Yad Vashem Search and Research Theories. His next book, The Night Without End, The Fate of Jews in German-Occupied Poland, which is also edited with Barbara Engelking, is his most recent publication and will be out in September 2022 with Indiana University Press. Today, Professor Grabowski will speak about June 1942 in Poland, Aktion, Reinhardt, and beyond. So, Professor Grabowski, please, the Zoom is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this kind presentation. Thank you for inviting me. I do have problems with this unstable internet, so signal me if you can't hear me, or if you have any problems, let me know. So once again, thank you for this invitation. And I don't have actually much of a text to read. I rather wanted here to share certain remarks about the inside of hell, which was Poland at the time that we have, let's say, seen the great theaters of war devolving in the Pacific and in European theater of war. And I will try to bring us to this pool of misery that for the Jews Poland has become before, during that time, and later on. Now, some of these events that have been mentioned by Professor Downing here a moment ago have registered in the minds and souls of desperate Polish Jews who are basically fighting for their survival in various ghettos and of the occupied land. Most of them filtered through various networks of gossip. Mind you, radios in Poland under the occupation were very much a forbidden item. Actually, there was even a penalty of death for owning a radio receiver, not only for Jews, but for Poles too. So this network of information was let's say, dominated by gossip. But actually, when preparing for our meeting, I was looking at the gossip circulating in major ghettos in Poland. You could see how actually this chain of information functioned well. So already in the first days of June 1942, the Jews of Warsaw were well informed about the assassination attempt and later the death of Reinhardt. And of course, there was huge hope riding on this particular piece of information, hoping that this assassination would trigger something much more important, a rebellion, perhaps pan-European rebellion. The problem, of course, when trying to merge military and political diplomatic history with the history of the Holocaust, is, as one can say in French, l'histoire à deux vitesses, history on two speeds. repeats. And this history of Jewish catastrophe has been playing itself out according to a much accelerated scenario, much more than anything that we can see in other theaters of that war. So the times for the Jews was simply reaching its end long before the armies of the Allied armies could have made any significant dent in the overwhelming power of the Axis, as Professor Downing so well described a moment ago. So there was hope. Until in June 1942, there was still hope. A few months later, this hope will be gone. But let's say that if you were in Poland in 1942 in June, you might still have an area of hope left to you, area which was shrinking very rapidly. Now, the news about the ongoing destruction, the news about the ongoing extermination reached Jewish settlements, Jewish communities fairly quickly. Now, going back a few months, the whole process of, let's say, industrial, modern state ordered and executed extermination began in mid-March 1942 in eastern provinces of the Generalgouvernement, as part of Poland has been called at the time. It started in a large ghettos in Lvov, in the Lublin area, and it was related to the opening of a place close to a small village that some of you, most of you, as you know, are familiar with, a small village of Bełżec, located a few miles west of Polish, Ukrainian, Belarusian border today on the Polish side. And this is the site of the first open factory of death site. And of course, the news could not be, let's say, withheld entirely. The news about the destruction, disappearance of various Jewish communities in Lublin and district, in Galician district, started to hit the largest communities, Jewish communities such as Łódź, Warsaw, Kraków, very quickly. Looking through my notes, I will try to bring to you some of the diaries. We don't have much time, so just a bit from diaries of the Jews who simply reported of what was the level of consciousness, knowledge in their communities. So, as you know, in March 1942, Bełżec is now open for death, so to say. Soon later, in May, it is Sobibór, and Treblinka will join in on the 23rd of July, 1942. You can say that this extraordinary pace of history of Jewish destruction, which started, of course, with the German occupation, acquired this horrifying tempo in late spring of 1942. If you look at what happened during these fateful months, you can look at the sheer numbers that in March of 1942, still close to 90% of Polish Jews were still alive. Now, fast forward to the end of 1942, and close to 90% of them have already been murdered. So this is when Lublin actually district, or as I teach my students, city of Lublin became the capital of the Holocaust. That's where you have in late May the formation of so-called Einsatzstab Reinhardt. These are people of Odilo Globocznik, Hermann Höfle, people whose names are actually obscure. If you look at the registers of war, if you look at monographs and history books devoted to history of World War II, names such as Höfle wouldn't even register in anything more than a footnote. Perhaps it's changing recently a bit, but Hermann Höfle, a lowly officer of the SS, was actually a person responsible personally for conducting the Aktion, the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto, among many others, being responsible, simply leading a campaign of extermination and that killed hundreds of thousands of people within a course of very few months. So what the news about this impending horrifying destruction is not something that the Jews of Poland can accept in any way, shape, or form. The thing is that our thinking as a community or as individuals is based on our individual or community experience. And there was nothing, literally nothing, that would prepare the Jewish community for things that were starting to happen. There is one thing to know, and another thing is to believe it. And this kind of information, which started to filter through to people's minds by June of 1942, was simply not, which was impossible to accept. The news about Bełżec, actually, I will find you here in a few moments. For instance, one Gina Mer, a young woman of Lvov, from Lvov ghetto, she wrote in her diary, which has been preserved in Yad Vashem archives, she wrote in the beginning of June of 1942, I quote, translating from Polish, people talk more and more about Bełżec and people being electrocuted there. So this is in early June, so 2.5 months after Bełżec opened. Now, a Polish retiree whose diaries, I mentioned diaries are something particularly important from historians' point of view. He was a retiree, a vicious anti-Semite, by the way, and he wrote in his diary under the date of 4th of June 1942. He was in Warsaw. And he wrote, they tell me that there is a concentration camp close to Bełżec, and the Germans brought their 28,000 Jews, and to this camp they deliver wagon loads of quicklime. So of course we are sure that they are liquidating the Jews in masses. So the news of this industrial destruction, mass murder, reached the Jewish communities. It was out in the open. People knew. The one thing is, you know. The second thing is, what do you do with this knowledge? And so what you have here is a term which I would like you to, which I wanted to bring to our discussion here, the term which has not been given enough attention, term which played itself out in June of 1942 across Poland, which is a term that Germans coined. It's called Aktionen. Aktionen, or the liquidation actions. Now, these liquidation actions have been known, of course, to all survivors. They were also known to non-survivors. They were also known to historians. However, they did not receive as much attention as they should have received. Now, so these two books, which I co-wrote and co-edited, which will be published in a shorter version later after this summer in English, I and my co-authors, we tried to look at various ghettos, and also I was particularly adamant to have a look day after day, or preferably hour after hour, at how these ghettos have been liquidated. Because what we need to understand is that the German objective was not only to deport the Jews to their deaths in the death sites, but also to do it very speedily. And lacking resources, they didn't have too many people to do this colossal work of horror. They had to terrorize the Jewish population beyond any kind of belief. And looking at these Aktionen, which occurred also in June of 1942, especially in the southern districts of General Gouvernement, we see the unprecedented level of terror. Now, I have a few things to share with you here for a moment. By the way, Boaz, how much time do I have? Because I don't want to go over time.
You have time. You can go ahead.
So just give me a sign, because I don't want to go over time. So I will share a screen here if it works. Yes, I wanted to show you a few not so well-known photographs, and it's not because I would like here to horrify you, but what I would like to show you, there is some kind of sound in background. So I would like to share some photos from these Aktionen, which I tried to focus in my research on Aktionen, which from various ghettos in Poland. What you can see is the multitude of different actors involved in the final moments of Jewish tragedy. Now, what the Germans tried to do is, I mentioned before, to introduce this level of horror and terror, unprecedented, into Jewish communities. One, in order to, let's say, make any kind of opposition, any kind of resistance impossible, basically to frighten people into submission. And the second important thing is to show to so-called bystanders, basically to mainstream Polish Gentile society, that the Jewish lives were worth absolutely nothing. And you can, these photographs that you will see here, some of them are taken from bystanders, let's say cameras, some are taken by the Germans, few are taken by the Jews. They showed to you the actions, how public these actions were. They were actually playing themselves out in the middle of Polish villages, towns, and cities. Now, from our research, what we found out was something quite extraordinary and horrifying, that in these actions, anywhere between 10 and 50% of ghetto population has been murdered in situ, on spot, in the place. Now, normally it was about 10%. But in ghettos which were distant from railway lines, for instance, where Jews needed to be marched on long distances, the percentage of Jews who were murdered during the action grew, as it happened in various ghettos of Lublin district, up to 50% of all ghettoized Jews. So here you see a few, this is actually the June 1942 first Aktion with thousands and thousands of Jewish inhabitants of Krakow being marched to the trains on their last way to Bełżec. One more here. Well, here on the right, you see a Polish blue policeman. Here you see the German policeman. And here you have crowds of people who are being marched through the middle of the city. It is a very public horror. People are being shot on sight. And this is what is left, actually. In the background here, you can see the characteristic walls of Krakow ghetto. And here you have the bundles, the suitcases. This what is remaining. This is a small ghetto from southern Poland being liquidated in August 1942. But here you have Lublin ghetto after the Aktion in March 1942. Once again, what is left for plunder, for stealing, for sales are humble belongings of their dead owners. And here you have Łosice, summer 1942, a small town I visited a few months ago. So the reason I showed you these pictures is to show to you that this public brutality, public horror, which played itself out at the time. Now, going back to this Krakow liquidation action of June 7, 1942, so exactly 80 years ago, I found a testimony of a Polish policeman, actually a good man, anti-Semite, but a good man nevertheless, Franciszek Banaś, who was helping the Jews despite his profound dislike of the Jews. And he wrote in his testimony, deposited with the Jewish Historical Commission, about these June events in 1942 in Krakow. He said, the German soldiers, various kinds of SS men and Gestapo officers, kept shooting at the Jews. The sanitation trucks and Polish youths drafted into the Baudienst followed the marching columns of Jews and collected the bodies and placed them on the trucks. The trucks delivered the bodies to the cemetery and dumped them to mass graves, which have been prepared in advance. So this is just one of this signs I mentioned to you that I will provide you with some insight from the Jewish side and bystander side. In Warsaw, in June 1942, there were many people who were writing constantly. One of these things that were done by the Jews was the right to register their unprecedented fate as long as they could. One of my personal, let's say, hero in terms of diary writing is Abraham Levin, one of the people close to Emanuel Ringelblum, member of Onek Shabbat, and he wrote one of the most horrifying and most moving at the same time diaries of the wartime, and it has been published as The Cup of Tears, and in his diary, Abraham Levin actually wrote it in Yiddish. And then once the liquidation of Warsaw began, a bit later, on the 22nd of July, he switched into Hebrew, into Holy Language. Now, I was looking through this diary for June, just to share with you, what was it that Abraham Levin wanted to leave us with? Well, he said, one, that good news from Bohemia. The killing of Heiderich, it might be a sign of changing times, he wrote. He still had hope. Now, there was gossip from Germany. Germans were losing the war because they were being bombed. The German cities finally were being bombed. But at the same time, he noted horrible news from Lublin, horrible news from Krakow. People are being electrocuted. Now here you can see the echoes, of the horrors from the time. Now the second thing, which of course has nothing to do with the distant war scenario, is the absolutely horrifying hunger which makes you oblivious to many other things, hunger which will allow you to go to, let's say, death transports. And instead of, let's say, receiving a kilogram of bread or two, reading a diary from Łódź. Some of you might know David Sierakowiak, another young boy of at the time of 16. He was to die soon in the Łódź ghetto, but in June 1942 he actually wrote a lot, but he wrote only about one thing, deadly hunger. He couldn't stand the hunger anymore. He was starved. He was being starved to death. At one point, translating from Polish here, he wrote, "I sat today in a theater. At least for 2 hours, one doesn't think about being hungry. War has to end soon, or we all shall die." Mordka Purman from Mławak ghetto noted that in June 1942, he said, they meet bastards in their conferences in London, and we die here by the thousands. So there is this desperation that they will live on, but time for us is gone, is no more. Rachel Auerbach, another powerful writer, friend from Warsaw Ghetto, she said, "Today I ran into a fleeing child of 6. He stole a loaf of bread, and he started crying, 'I am not a thief, I am just a grubber.'" Now, who was a grubber? Grubber were kids who were simply grabbing a piece of bread, stuffing it in their mouths before it could have been wrestled away from there. 8-9 June 1942, Gestapo kills 60 people in the ghetto. Adam Kamienny from June 1942 from a small ghetto, Kałuszyn. Actually, if you ever go east of Warsaw, you can go through a dead city today, a city without soul. It was a shtetl, Kałuszyn. Now it's a city that has not reached its pre-war population, which has no soul, has no ghetto, but it was, Adam Kamienny wrote in June 1942 that there was a woman with 3 children murdered by the German gendarmes at the side of the road, which was frequented by all workers going to a local mill. And they buried them actually on the dirt road, and people were simply walking over this place after a few days without any kind of further thought. And I guess, you know, I have many other things to share. So just to finish it off, I will tell you that in June of 1942, Abraham Levin and hundreds of thousands of Jews still could hope against hope after July 22nd, when the so-called Aktion Warsaw, or the Great Deportation of Warsaw, has begun. Their hopes vanished for good. So that will be, I guess, all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very, very much to both presenters. My name is Jan Burzlaff, and I'm a fellow at Harvard University and part of the organizing team. And I'm delighted to be here with all of you. Thanks for these truly fascinating two papers. Thanks to Taylor and Jan. And I will lead us all of us through the Q&A tonight. And I will suggest we start with one question for each presenter, and then we'll just take it from there. A question that arises for Taylor is from Boaz, in light of your paper, how we can then explain the general poor showing of the British Army. And for Jan, that is a question that came up during your paper. Having read your foundational works on the hunt for Jews, on the rural Polish society, listening to you, what we see here, I believe, is a turning point, the onset of mass murder in 1942, which really clearly radicalized many factions and fractures of Polish society. And I remember elsewhere you have written that Jewish life lost all value in the eyes of ordinary Poles in 1942. Would you situate this in June, in the summer, early in the spring 42, or later in the fall? And in biggest ghettos versus small open ghettos, do you see any differences there? And that also builds on a question by Daniela Joya, who asked, why was there still these mass shootings in the fall when the death camps were in effect working? So I think these two questions, and we'll take it from there.
Thank you. Yes. What an interesting paper from Jan. Just to say, first of all, how fascinating that was, and the sources that you were quoting from, most of which were new to me, were absolutely fascinating. I think the question was, why did the British Army fail so tremendously in 1942? I think there's lots of explanations, lots of theories about that. Britain had not been prepared for the sort of war that came in 1940. Much of its equipment was outdated. It lost an enormous amount of equipment. Talk about armored vehicles, artillery, just basic trucks, just transports of all sorts. Dunkirk, when it retreated across the Channel at the end of May, beginning of June 1940. And the decision was taken, although it was already becoming apparent that many of its tanks weren't up to scratch, certainly weren't good competitors with the German panzers, and its artillery was too weak, that it was just too difficult to try and rebuild the British armaments industry to construct better, more efficient weaponry. And so it remained with the old 1930s machinery, that even though those in command knew this wasn't really up to fighting an efficient German army, although it did slightly better against the Italians. So that's one reason. I think technically the British Army was not prepared, poorly prepared, underprepared for the conflicts of the war that followed. But I think more than that, there was still a very much an old school attitude within the army, particularly the commanders, the officers, that again wasn't really suited for a war against a very efficient professional set of armies, both in the Far East and in Europe. I talk about this quite a lot in the book, that again, there's all sorts of theories and explanations that the British Army just wasn't determined enough. It hadn't sufficiently given value and worth to the profession of arms. It was too amateur in many, many ways. That was changing by 1942, and by the latter part of the war, the British Army emerges as a far more efficient fighting force. But I think in 1942, Britain was still fighting with an army with weaponry that was outdated, that hadn't been improved, and with attitudes that reflect the pre-war attitudes. And I think the presence of the American army in Britain, when Americans started to arrive in large numbers, as well as the very poor performance on the battlefield in 1942, did bring quite long-lasting changes. But in 1942, Britain hadn't been prepared, as I said, to be fighting on so many fronts at the same time. It had the wrong weaponry and it had the wrong attitudes. And I think all of this was a sort of a perfect storm, if you like, of inefficiencies, of failings that came together in that year that, thank God, slowly changed as the years passed. New attitudes in the army transformed the way the British military was organized. So if that is a sort of answer, I think that's what I would that's what I would argue.
Okay, very briefly to respond to these questions, starting with the second one, actually in the beginning, to place it in the beginning. So, well, the death camps, which, for instance, Treblinka has been described by Franz zu Hommel, who was one of the SS guards responsible for so-called Arbeitsjuden, or working Jews. He described it during his conversation with Claude Lanzmann in Shoah. He described it as a primitive but efficient factory line of death. And indeed, that's what they were. These factories of death were very primitive, and they were very often collapsing. They, in other words, the Germans had to improvise. So the mass shootings were in addition to, and they never stopped. And now the thing is that if you look at this question, when the Jewish life ceased in the minds of very many Poles or Ukrainians or Belarusians to have any worth at all, of course it depends on the area. It depends on the time. If you look at areas where the Jews were simply living in much smaller numbers, the situation was different. But now, if you look at the smaller ghettos, and these are the ghettos which were the vast majority of Jews actually dwelled until the very end of their lives. We usually, when you think about the destruction of Jewish communities, you think about Warsaw, you think about Krakow, you think about Łódź. You shouldn't. This is a minority. The majority are people who are living in ghettos between 2,000 and 10,000 strong. That's where the vast majority of Jews will meet their end. And in my own work, I came across this studying smaller places such as Węgrów, 50 miles northeast of Warsaw. What you can see is the devilishly clever way in which the Germans designed their system of destruction, which basically was open to various actors, which encouraged initiative. So basically, whenever the Germans lacked resources, they pulled in or they encouraged the local population. For instance, Polish voluntary firefighters in Węgrów, they were primary movers of the liquidation. Now, what happens once the initial thrust of liquidation is over? Thousands upon uncounted, tens of thousands of Jews are hiding under their homes, under their houses. And now, who is going to pull them out of these hideouts? The Germans are gone. On the second day, the German Liquidierungskommando is gone. Now, this would be the local Polish police or the firefighters or simply the Gokers, the locals, the bystanders, who are morphing into something much unlike bystanders. So to answer your question, it was when the Jewish life became worth nothing, dependent on area and time, but you can say that it was spring and summer of 1942.
Thank you very much to both. We have a question for Taylor by Shmuel Yerushalmi, who asked, what, in your opinion, contributed more to the Nazi defeat, the ultimate Nazi defeat, Al Alamein, the battle, or the Battle of Stalingrad?
Yes, well, there's absolutely no question that the titanic military battles of the Second World War were fought on the Eastern Front. The fact that Stalingrad followed El Alamein marks, I think, on the two fronts that Germany was fighting, very, very significant turning points. But there's absolutely no question that I can't give you the exact numbers, but the number of divisions that Rommel had in Africa was, I think, 8. I think at El Alamein he had 8 German and Italian divisions. On the Eastern Front, not just in Stalingrad, but right the way across the front from the Baltic to the Black Sea. I think the Germans had something like 160 divisions. So the scale of fighting in North Africa was very small. But Hitler did put a lot of emphasis on it. He had his favorite, most daring general there, Rommel. So the answer to your question is there's absolutely no question at that point of the war that the battle of the turning point in Stalingrad on the Eastern Front was far more significant than that in the West. But this marks the first appearance in Operation Torch that I briefly mentioned, the Anglo-American landings in Northwest Africa. That marks the first appearance of American ground troops in the war, land forces. In 1942, the bombing offensive was still relatively limited against Germany. There had been the first ever 1,000 bomber raid in the end of May 1942, but that was a one-off. Most bombing raids were relatively small scale. All that scales up in 1943 onwards, and of course in 1944 the second front is fully opened with the invasion of Europe on D-Day. So I think things do change to a degree, but there's absolutely no question in my mind that the truly great military land battles of the Second World War and the defeat militarily of the German forces came on the Eastern Front.
Thank you very much. Then we have a question more broadly for Jan by Tamari, who's very interested in the idea of Lublin and the geographical importance of Aktion Reinhardt in Lublin for the general government.
Okay, well, this is actually, I went last year on a little historical expedition to Lublin, and moving from one site to another, from one area to another, the area is littered with traces, sometimes long forgotten, of Jewish catastrophe. When you make your way close to Lublin, actually, driving from the west, you will find yourself in a small, tiny village of Poniatowa. And a few people know that Trawniki, Poniatowa nearby were on November 3 and 4 places of, I believe, greatest machine gunning of human beings in the history of mankind. 43,000 Jews have been massacred in the course of 2 days in these sites, making it the largest mass murder of this kind in human history, I believe. No one, well, in major history books, if you look at Aktion Erntefest, that's how the Germans called it, the action of end of the summer, harvest festival. This was to finish off the last remaining Jews of Lublin district. But before, you can see that you have here, you don't have many traces left by the Germans in this respect, but you cannot annihilate millions of people without leaving some documentary also traces. So if you go to the archive, you will see the correspondence, you will see the telegrams exchanging hands, you will see the SS correspondence, and you will see the abandoned sites of death, which nowadays slowly come back, so to say, to our memory. They are being sometimes redecorated, or small monuments are being created. But if you look at the history of the Holocaust, at the history of the modern so-called industrial scale destruction, the camps in Treblinka, Bełżec, Sobibór, Majdanek were directed from Lublin.
Thank you very much. And we have a question for both. I think it can be answered by both of you about the memory of the Russian, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, 1939-41, what impact this had. And I believe the question really goes to the initial cooperation, how this furthered, from your angle of study, the unfolding of the war.
Well, just to come in briefly there, yes. I mean, I think the question was sort of, why shouldn't we blame the Russians for that? I mean, I think everyone in Britain was completely horrified at the signing of the pact in August of 1939. Of course, Russia then had its war with Finland, the Winter War, and so on. I don't think there's any question that was an incredibly cynical act on both parts. And certainly in Britain, I don't think anybody thanks the Russians. I don't know that we blame the Russians particularly, but I don't think anybody thanks the Russians for that at all. I think it's very clear that it was he gave the go-ahead, the thumbs up for Hitler to invade Poland, and Stalin was able to achieve his ambition of occupying Eastern Poland. Britain tried hard to warn Stalin in 1941 that an attack was coming. Churchill sent him several messages with very specific intelligence reports that an attack was coming. As we all know, he refused to take any notice of them. But then, of course, what happens in Britain is that there's a tremendous support for Russia, for the Russian war effort. Almost every town in Britain had what was called a Russian war week, in which tremendous output from factories, whether it's military factories or whether it was clothing or food or whatever, was sort of allocated to Russia. Even Stalin becomes a popular figure in the press. He becomes Uncle Joe, sort of, kind uncle in Britain. Extraordinary now to think of it. So I think whilst there was no credit given to Stalin and Molotov in August 1939, I think it certainly is the case that the Soviet war effort was very highly regarded in Britain. It was one of the reasons why Cripps became such a popular figure, because he'd been associated with that rather than the British military failures, as I've said. And the Russian war effort becomes an immensely popular campaign, not just amongst left-wingers in Britain, but amongst the broader population. This is a campaign that has to be fought and won by the Soviets.
It's actually, I can jump here. It's actually quite interesting to see the dichotomy of historiographical discourse, and putting on my Polish historian's hat at this stage. I have several hats I can wear. As I can tell that this perspective in Polish independent historiography has been totally different. I mean, the war has been seen to an extent through the prism of Soviet invasion of Eastern Poland on 17th of September 1939 as an inexcusable form of state aggression. And then what really sunk the whole thing to the bottom in terms of any chances of the Soviets to do any headways with Polish, let's say, public opinion was, of course, the Katyń massacre, which came to light in April 1943. Something that was the largest mass execution of prisoners of war, also, I believe, in history, and something which Goebbels termed his greatest success during the war in terms of propaganda value. So when Poland broke off relations with the Soviet Union in 1943, I mean, these bridges have been burned. And in the independent Polish public opinion, this question of rehabilitation of Soviet Union never really was possible.
Thank you very much to both. And as the tradition wants it, I will now pass on to Boaz for the final and concluding remarks.
Indeed, a dichotomy of historical views, which we can see here on one hand, but in the end, the story comes together. And I think there was one note in the chat about a book which I didn't know about, which is called 1942, The Year of Peril. And that's about the US in 1942. And and the idea is, I think what we see here, we should look at that period through the eyes of the people who are making decisions, both decision makers and everyone is making a decision at that time. And when you look at it from 1942, it's really bleak. I think it's an understatement to say that it's bleak, especially for these Jews in the ghettos, but also for decision makers like Churchill. And I think this shows how much important is what we are doing here. This bringing together the history of the war and the history of mass murder of the Holocaust, And I can only but thank the two wonderful speakers who really showed us how important this is. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
There is another interesting question, but I'm not sure if Jan Grabowski would like to refer to it. So it's up to you, Jan.
I am here ready to refer to anything you want me to refer to.
There are two Jans here.
Yeah, the question is, just seeing it, David Grabowski asking if that he sees many similarities with Tim Snyder. And I believe he's referring to Bloodlands here and parts of Black Earth. He's talking about the small camps, the double occupation thesis, the mass shootings. So he wonders if you, what you think of Tim Snyder's work and if you are in correspondence.
Well, that's a family question. Thank you, David. But in any case, the thing is that actually Tim Snyder, in details mentioned here, I of course agree. However, in a broad kind of interpretation of history, I don't. For Tim Snyder, came up with this idea that basically Bloodlands was an area, what happened to the Jews was simply a historical sort of accident because they lived in a very, very poor neighborhood. That this part of Eastern Europe simply tended to kill each other. And the Jews were victims of circumstance. Well, I don't subscribe to that opinion. I don't agree with him. I think there is a lot to be said about anti-Semitism that has not been said in that particular book. But of course, in terms of description of factual events on the ground, I agree with Snyder, but not in the broad lines of his reasoning, so to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone so much. And thank you, Professor Grabowski and Tyler Donning. Thank you so much for being here. And to our lovely audience and the organizers. So have a good day or good night, depending on where you are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Bye, thank you.
Bye, thanks.
Thank you very
Bye.
much. And I'd like to thank Dr. Daniela Ozacky Stern for hosting this wonderful event. Thank you, Daniela,
Thank you.
for
Thank you.
managing all of us.
Thanks.
Good evening.
Have a good evening to all of you. Thank you.
Good
Bye.
evening.
Good evening.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.